Only 3 weeks to the UK referendum, and the margin between the two viewpoints is tightening. A recent survey by The Guardian shows a 52-48 split in favour of the UK leaving the EU. This is quite a serious issue, both for UK, certainly more for the UK, but also for Europe. So we've turned to Michel Girardin, Professor of Macroeconomics at the University of Geneva, to have an idea of what the impact would be on the economies. Michel, good afternoon.
Hello, Nicolette. Yes, I was quite shocked this morning when I saw the results of this poll. There's actually this inversion of the trend, because up until today, we had the Remain camp ahead of the Leave, the Brexit, those in favor of Brexit, although the lead was shrinking. So I wonder whether maybe it's David Cameron's show yesterday on TV, where we saw that he was okay-ish on economic grounds, but not so good on the migration issue. Because that is, I believe, the biggest problem with this dealing with Brexit, is that the debate is flawed, because we have those who are in favor of remaining in the EU who point to the huge cost. Indeed, David Cameron is accused of scaremongering the population with these scenarios of wars and depression and deep recession in the UK if the UK were to leave the EU. So those in favor of Remain point to the huge costs of leaving. And those who favor the Brexit, the Leave, points to the huge costs, but in political terms, more regarding the migration crisis, which Europe is currently going through. So there's no real matching here between the two. It's economics versus migration.
It is really, and as the campaign, the pro-leaving EU campaign is gathering momentum, you can really see that it's kind of it's nearly taking the lead now, which is clearly has a big impact, which is already perceptible in the economic figures.
That's right.
As you have pointed out.
Right, and we can see this on this chart. We see that the growth in the UK is slowing. And actually industrial surveys show that 50% of the firms are either postponing or cutting spending in the UK ahead of the June 23. So we see this also in this blue line on this chart shows that industrial confidence is actually abating now. So the Brexit fear is already showing on growth in the UK.
And it's also showing on the pound.
Indeed, pound has been falling, but we should be aware that it has been a permanent fall since I've been in the UK. As the pound has just been steadily falling. Here you see it on this chart, the two lines. One is the sterling versus the Swiss franc. Okay, so we're comparing.
Yes, that's a bit unfair for the sterling.
That's right. But I mean, do you know how much sterling was against the Swiss franc when the fixed exchange rate mechanism of Bretton Woods was abandoned in 1973?
No, I can't remember.
12 Swiss franc to buy £1. And now we're at 160, 140 something, okay? Yes. So. And you see here the correlation also with the fact that the sterling has been falling also. The second curve in blue is actually the best measure we can think of for a currency. That's the real effective exchange rate. So it's against the basket in real terms. And basically the idea is when you want to answer your question, where is sterling going from here? The answer is best given by looking at this blue line. Basically, the idea is that this blue line should be stationary. There should not be real excessive deviations from the mean of this blue line. And implicit there, you can make some measures as deviations from PPP, purchasing power parity. And the conclusion by looking at this blue line is that we are not very far from fair value. So yes, there could be some downside if Brexit were to materialize, but we are not very, the downside is limited.
Okay, but what kind of effect is Brexit going to have on the UK equity market, for example?
Well, linking to this real effective exchange rate, here we can see on this chart a pretty tight correlation between the outperformance of the UK market vis-à-vis the world equity market. So here we're talking about MSCI UK versus MSCI World, and that's the red line. And in blue is the same real effective exchange rate. So but the real effective exchange rate here is shown on the right-hand scale, but inverted. So a rise in this blue line, like between 2007 and 2009, actually points to a weakening of sterling in real effective terms. And you can see that this coincides with an outperformance of the UK equity market vis-à-vis the world. And this has a simple reason, is that the UK is actually, one is not really aware of this, but is actually the country amongst the developed countries which has the largest share of its companies in the FTSE 100, which rely on foreign demand, which are international. So it's only 23% of the UK equity market in the FTSE 100, which is domestic in terms of sales. That proportion is much higher in the Eurozones, it's 56%, and still much higher in the US, it's 70%. So UK, if you want to have this traditional trade of, like in Japan, for instance, of buying the market when you expect the currency to weaken, UK is the place to go.
So what you're saying in other terms is that UK is benefiting from an export-oriented industry.
Right.
And is the rise of the UK value in the equity market due also to emerging markets, to sales to emerging markets?
Indeed, indeed. UK is also very, the UK market is also very exposed to emerging market trends. So that's a further reason. If we are expecting now, let's see what happens now in China, which is the main focus when you look at emerging market. But now that these fears of a hard landing are abating, and we see that the Chinese economy is doing quite well, that is also a positive argument to get exposure around the UK, because it's very exposed to emerging markets.
What is not very discussed is the impact of Brexit on the European Union. There's a lot that's been written and discussed on the negative economic impact of Brexit on UK.
Right.
But what impact will it have on the EU?
Okay, well, certainly much smaller if we're talking about in economic terms. The share of exports from the Eurozone that go to the UK is maybe 88% of total exports from the Eurozone. Conversely, in the UK, 44% of the exports to the UK go to the continental Europe, as they say, Eurozone. Okay, so here clearly we can estimate. I mean, scenarios vary. Those who are highlighted by the Treasury Department in the UK are very, very scary. I mean, I think we can make a point here that David Cameron is scaremongering the population by these terrible scenarios. But it's certainly going to be much worse for the UK than for the European Union if there's a Brexit. But I would say it's we can estimate 5 to 10 times worse for the UK than for the impact on growth than for the European Union. But the problems, the problems, it's not so much economically, but it's more political. Exactly. This would highlight to a failure of the institution, this building of 27 nations within a political... 28, sorry. And yes, there will be fears, contagions, give other examples. Probably Sweden would be next. This is a country where the gap between, if asked, would there be a referendum, would you be leaving or staying? Should I stay? Should I go? Probably Sweden will be next. So For markets in general, this would be not very good. We would have Brexit. We've had Grexit, now Brexit, then Swexit. You know, what next? You know, then exit. Central banks quitting their liquidity injections. That is not very favorable for finding entry points on the markets.
I think one of the big questions is whether the UK stays or goes. Will the European Union, I mean the central administration of the European Union, understand the message? Will they understand the lessons to be learned? Because it doesn't seem, we hear a lot of threats, a lot of critics, but we don't hear much of, you know, self-evaluation from the EU authorities as to how responsible they are for countries wanting to leave.
All right. Margaret Thatcher used to say that the European Union was half-baked, half-cooked, and she is right. If we, I'll answer your question, but just to make a small, put this in perspective, the European Union has made its integration from a monetary and currency point of view stance. But it's still lacking the fiscal policy discipline. Basically, you cannot rule a country made of 28 states who each run their fiscal policy, their budget policy independently. It's not working. We saw that in Greece. And basically what is heavily displeasing the UK voters is this idea that Brussels comes and tells the Britons what to do in terms of their spending, for instance, or their subsidizing agriculture and what next. But the problem is that if we want the European Union to work, if we want, as Victor Hugo said, les États-Unis d'Europe, there cannot be a single monetary policy, but 28 different fiscal policies. So that's the price to pay if you want to stay in the Eurozone. It's like in Switzerland, you know, you cannot have independent cantons to a certain degree, yes, but you need a federal state, and basically you need to give up some of your sovereignty to a centralized authority. This is actually the price to pay. There's no free lunch here.
Thank you, Michel. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Nicolette.